But you touched on business meetings, and I'd like to call up Amber Frost, who will be talking about business meetings.
Thank you, Dorian. How many people are in clubs that regularly have business meetings?
How do you define regularly?
Yeah. So I define regularly either by every single meeting or once a month. Most clubs. There are some clubs that do not do that. There are some clubs that do not ever have a formal business meeting until they need to elect officers. And for those of you who are in one of those clubs, or for those of you that have no experience of chairing a business meeting, it can be a very daunting task. You may have been to every single one of your club's business meetings, but when you come to chair, it's a whole different issue. So what I have done is I have created a chairman's checklist, and Dorian will hand them out. And what this is you can have this at every single business meeting, and you can just follow the chairman's checklist. So the first thing, as the chairman, you need to do is be friends with your gavel. We don't have a gavel up here, but be friends with your gavel. Do not be afraid to use your gavel. And one thing that I do say is, if you're going to use your gavel, don't just go, because the only people who will hear it are you and the person right in front of you. Really bang that gavel, especially if there's a lot of chat going on in the room, if people are not focused on you at the front. So the first thing you have to do is call your meeting to order, and Janet has a gavel. So it's quite simple, and the terminology is here on the chairman's checklist. I call this business meeting to order. Bang the gavel, nice and loud. And then you ask the secretary for a quorum. Is there a quorum in the room? And this is where Dorian's pointed. If this is your one business meeting a year when you're electing your officers, you need to have already determined how many people are needed to be a quorum. That is why your executive needs to meet at least 1 week in advance of the meeting and make that decision. Now, in the example that Katrina gave, where you have a Toastmaster that is going to be absent for a 2-month period while they're away working or something, the executive may decide that they are inactive because they cannot be present to vote. It's not that they just chose not to show up. They cannot be present. So that is why it's very important. Now, there's also the possibility that your club secretary is not present at this particular business meeting, in which case you need to have appointed someone in advance to take the minutes. And I would strongly recommend you do that before you bang that gavel. Even if you're standing at the front of the room and say, oh, I need someone to take the minutes, that's fine. Just make sure that you have somebody minuting the meeting. The next thing that you will do in your business meeting is ask for the minutes of the previous meetings. Now, clubs that have regular business meetings very often will circulate the minutes from the previous meeting by email. Sometimes their secretary forgets, or that's not the standard practice in the club. Or you haven't had a business meeting since the last election last year, in which case the secretary will read the minutes. Then you ask for errors or omissions. You just follow this. Ask for errors or omissions. If there are none, hearing none, I adopt the minutes as read. If there are corrections, oh, my name is spelled wrong, oh, it wasn't Fred, it was Joe. Make the corrections, and once all the corrections are made, I adopt the minutes as amended. If you don't have the minutes, which also sometimes happens, especially if it's been a year and you can't remember who the secretary was the last time around, you can put aside the reading of the minutes of the previous meeting. You cannot vote on them, you cannot accept them if you don't have them to read. So it's very important when you have a business meeting that the president has a copy of those minutes sent to them immediately. Bev.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm supposed to.
That's okay.
Can I ask that?
Yes, you can.
Yes. There are some clubs where, as you said, the minutes go around by email, and the secretary's not gonna stand up and read the whole
No,
page.
no. If the minutes have been circulated,
Mhm.
especially for, if you have regular, every week you have a meeting, the minutes get circulated, and then it's, did everyone receive the minutes? Have you all had a chance to read? And everyone's going, yes, I got them. No, I didn't read them. Are there any errors or omissions? And probably there's going to be people in the room quickly scanning them or trying to remember. I read them last week and I don't. In which case, that's how you deal with that. The other thing I want to point out at this time is that the minutes of this meeting, when you are electing your officers, are critical. Because when you go to change signatories at the bank, they will ask you for a copy of the minutes. Even if the only thing you do at the business meeting is elect the officers, you have to have minutes. And the minutes will state the meeting, who you are, what the time and day is of the meeting, where you met, who was present, anybody's regrets, and then the agenda. And underneath the agenda will be, so minutes of the previous meeting, read and accepted. Any business arising, none. Unfinished business, I'll get to the whole thing. But then when you have the election of officers, you have to detail the election. Whether the nominations came from the nominating committee, came from the floor, however the nominations are made, it all needs to be minuted, whether or not there was an actual election, whether the president just cast, or secretary just cast one ballot, etc., etc. That all needs to be minuted because the bank wants to know that somebody has not just appointed themselves as treasurer so that they can run away with all $53.27. So then we get to business arising. And if you only have one meeting a year, then you probably won't have any business arising. But if you have a regular, weekly, monthly business meeting, there may be some business arising. And this is generally where so-and-so said they were going to do something, did they actually do it, and what is their report? Or, oh, there was a motion made that we were going to buy a new banner, what's happening with that? Something along those lines. Unfinished business, which a lot of people make the mistake of put old business, but it should be unfinished business, is anything that has not reached completion. So a motion was put forward to buy a new banner, it was passed unanimously, the banner hasn't been ordered yet. That becomes unfinished business because the banner has not been ordered or arrived in the club. The reason it is not old business is because if you put old business on the agenda, somebody is going to stand up and say, oh, I remember there was a motion 7 years ago that we should do this. Okay, so it's unfinished business. Then you go through your reports, which includes correspondence, and clubs will vary on the order of reports, whether they start with the Sergeant at Arms and go up to President, whether they start with the President and go down to Sergeant at Arms. Usually, the President goes last because then they fill in the gaps that haven't been talked about of business that needs to, reports that need to be mentioned. So now you come to the order of the new business and the order of elections. So the new business, and on the back of your chairman's checklist, you'll see a very brief overview of how to deal with motions, including terminology. So I'm not going to go through it because some motions are going to be, covered? Okay. But the salient information is on the back of the checklist, and when the election is moved, that is when the motions come into play. And Scott's going to cover how to do the elections. When it's all over and done with, I declare the business meeting closed and whap that gavel really loud once again. And that is chairing the meeting. Does anyone have any questions? Jen?
Yes, are we going to be covering the actual club elections, like
Yes.
how to do it?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Going back a step, like most of the, at least at our club, are the minutes are sent over on the email. We always try to have at least one copy, hard copy of those minutes. So if there's question, that you can go to the hard copy, not just by memory.
The secretary should have a copy of the minutes, but if the secretary's not present, then, but you should always try and have a copy of the minutes of the previous meetings as much as possible.
And we go to elections, I believe it's proper to have a notice of motion of the evening?
Scott will cover that.
Okay.
Glenn.
You might have to answer this later, but I run a situation where someone who do minutes as circulated, and you have a person who hates email. You know the person. They think it's evil. And they will demand that you must read those minutes every single week. And there must be a way to say email is access, or some way of saying email is how we communicate. Or are you stuck giving in to these people every single time?
That's something that you'll need to deal with outside of the business meeting, and have a conversation with them, and maybe provide them with a hard copy at the beginning of the meeting, beginning of the Toastmasters meeting. Yeah, so they have a chance to read it. If they refuse, I mean, why have they got an email address if they're refusing to read it? That's a whole other issue. And if they're refusing to accept this, then you can just provide them with a copy of the minutes before the meeting begins, so with enough time for them to read it and look for errors and omissions.
But couldn't you cover it with a motion saying that the
Yeah, but
policy
there's
of the
always-
club will be?
Yeah, but there's always going to be somebody, right?
Well,
who
it's covered
disagrees.
enough, but that's the policy of the club because it's being covered by a motion.
And that would be one way of dealing with it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or get a big gavel, bigger gavel.
Bigger or a dog. And with that, I will pass the session across